Great. Welcome back to this afternoon's pension task force meeting. We have, I think, a fairly comfortable agenda that should allow us to ask questions and sort of take our time as we go through a presentation from Stephen Klein with respect to the revenue updates that that were presented a few days ago, and then back again to Chris Roop for a few presentations. So Senator Parent, I just want to make sure that we have audio connection with you.
Yep, I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. And there's less of a time delay this time, which is really great. So I would welcome you if you have a question, just, you know, say hello or give, I'm not watching you on the monitors because I'm watching the people around the table, but I want you to know that just in terms of facilitating, that you're welcome to, you know, give us some sort of audio signal that you want to get in the queue for questions.
All right, thanks, I appreciate it.
And folks around the table again, you know, questions, observations, feel free to give a signal. So welcome, Stephen Klein. It occurs to me that this may be one of the final times that I get to chair a meeting where we have you come in to talk to us about the landscape in front of us. So I really appreciate you being with us today and your willingness to help interpret what was presented at the revenue update.
Okay, thank you very much. And I did take time to listen to a little of my testimony last week, and I realized I still talk way too fast. So if I start getting incoherent or talk too fast, slow me down. And if you don't understand anything or you don't understand something, then let me know. And I'll try to slow it down myself, but it's an issue. So what I was going to do is first, and you know, without a whiteboard or without a thing, it's always great. I used to have a pointer, but we're going to go over this document first, a little bit. And I'm going to then talk about the ed fund a little bit. And then talk about some of where it leaves us. And it's very similar to where I was last week about what happened to the money and what sort of the implications are for your work. And so the first thing I do is if you opened up this document, if you have it online either way, on the first internal page has a chart on it, which basically recommends the revenue changes from January 2021 forecasts. So we do forecasts essentially twice a year in a normal time. So we did a January forecast and a July forecast. And what you'll see in this one is the forecast went up 190 million, which is, you know, about 10%. It's about 19 million per percent in the general fund. And then the red line is in FY23 is projected up 199 million. So you have $200 million basically for 2 years as a forecast increase. And you can see the transportation fund up 13 and 14 million in that same period. And it's, we'll talk a lot more about this. But that's not quite as much, but it's still sizable. And then the ed fund similarly, pretty dramatically. And it's purchase, use, and sales tax up 39 million and 54 million. So we did have an amazing revenue upgrade. And what's interesting about it, it's not a one-year event. This one talks about a 2-year event on this sheet. But what I'd like to do is turn to a very confusing page, and then we'll come back and do more later. But if everybody could turn to the back of the forecast, and you'll see a page of numbers, which is called Available General Fund. And it's unfortunately, my copy isn't numbered. So it's, if you go 36. Yours is 36. 36. Okay, cool. It's called Table 1, State of Vermont, which is sort of odd because it's not Table 1. It's Table 1, State of Vermont Legislative Joint Fiscal Office Available General Fund Revenue Forecast. So are we there? Okay, so what and we're going to start at the bottom, and we're going to go in all different directions here. But if you look at the general fund, and you're going to 20, you see in FY20, the bottom number is 1.642, or actually, what is it? $1,640,000,000. And then you see a 7.8% growth to the 1767. Then it goes up 5% to the 1853. And then you see the growth rate being 2.7, 2.2, 2.2, and 2.4. And so this is what we talked about last week, that we're seeing a major increase. We're not seeing a decline, but we're also not seeing continued growth. And so the first thing is, all these numbers are very, very tentative. This is we're still in the middle of a pandemic. We don't really know if the federal largesse is going to continue. The numbers could be bigger. They could be smaller, and if we were to go back to that first page, and you don't have to do it, I'll just sort of do it with you. The first paragraph, I'll do it with and tell you about it. The first paragraph says, we're in the midst of an epic economic experiment with unprecedented fiscal and monetary intervention. The absence of historical precedents with respect to the scope, magnitude, and timing of such intervention creates considerable future uncertainty, and the long-term impacts may ultimately be transformatively beneficial or disastrous. We just don't know. And so when you look at this chart, on the one hand, it tells, we're going to talk about it as if it's the reality, but it's not the reality. It's sort of our picture of what we think is going to happen. And so that's a really important caveat. I mean, it's just, but what those numbers tell us, and as I quietly need to get back there myself, is that we've had a major up of revenues. It's going to stick around, but the growth won't be sticking around necessarily. It's just projected to be in the 2% range. But the next thing, before I want to go into more of talking about this, is another thing that this thing you can see on this is right now 7% of our source general fund revenue is from two areas, from just the income taxes, corporate and personal income. And years ago, we had sales tax go into that fund. Meals and rooms tax, more of it went in that fund. Some of it went now to clean water, and some of it went to the education fund, meals and rooms. We also had a larger share of state tax, although state tax is doing quite well at its lower level. And so we were in 2019, the personal income tax and the corporate represented maybe 60% of the fund. And now it's in that 67, 68%. And as you move more and more of your revenue into corporate and personal income, you increase the volatility of that fund. So on the one hand, we have nice numbers that says we went up a lot and we're going to go up at 2, 1.8, 2, 2.3. But A, we have the pandemic. B, we have the unclarity of the federal government. And C, we really are in a more volatile fund. So all those things come at us when we sort of figure out what do you do with the money. So when we think about it, you have this roughly $200 million of an upgrade. And so what the legislators were, when they're hearing about this, you could sense from them this question: how much of this do we treat as ongoing? How much of it do we treat as maybe we don't spend it all as ongoing money? We spend some of it as ongoing, and some of it we build in. We spend it one time because each year is going to, there's risk. There's tremendous risk that this could go up or down. And so one of the things you're going to be facing is sort of this question among legislators: do we consider 60, 80% of that to be essentially an increase that's going to stick around for a while? Do we spend less than the full amount because we know the growth rates were low? How much do we spend at one time? So there's all these sort of pieces that are going to be discussed in the budget process. Let me stop there and just see if I've lost everybody, or so far so good. Okay, and let me, how I want to do this. So I think what I'd like to do is, since we have time, and before I go on to the education one, we turn back to this, the beginning of this document, and we'll just flow through some of the charts, which we went over before, and just give you a flavor of what this document is. And what we do is every 6 months when this forecast happens, Tom Cabet, who's our forecaster, submits what he calls the economic review and revenue forecast. So it has both numbers in it and has stories, basically not stories, but his picture of what's going on in the state. And so it's really not a bad read. So if you're really bored at home, you can read through the whole thing. But what's really new in this year is, if you look at the first thing in his first section is epidemiological update. And we're talking about the pandemic being the cornerstone. And this first chart is very similar to what we saw before. You see the vaccination rates in Vermont, we're #1 in the country. A lot of the same data you saw about we're really low on hospitalizations. And then you get to this, if I'm gonna just do federal government spending, you'll start seeing, we think in Vermont, the number is somewhere around $10 billion that has come in the last 3 years for COVID related support. It can go to, some went to individuals, so it's going to individuals, some went to the state. It's a lot of money. And that's why, that's been the big driving force for this economy. And then you get to this chart on, well, you guys have page numbers. It's got red, it looks like this. And we showed you that last time. Now you can see the COVID response. It's just the deficit is pretty much, it's really dramatic. It's actually greater, this amount of money they put into this exceeds what was spent in World War II. And that was one of the, I think it's on one of his charts, but when we get to it, but it's a very big, what the federal government has done to deal with this is really unprecedented. So it does create this sort of sense, and it's not going to go on forever. It's creating a sense of, as a person who deals with budgets, we want to be conservative. We want to sort of not count on this. We want to sort of figure out how to use it in a way that puts the state at less risk. And you'll hear things building our reserves, maybe spending less on ongoing than we could otherwise. So those themes will be constantly talked about, and we'll come back to how they affect you. What else? The fact that the federal stimulus, not all that's entered, only a portion of this is entered the economy. We got in last March, $1.25 billion in addition to the coronavirus relief fund. While we've appropriated that, none of that's been spent yet, and it's hasn't gone out the door. Just this last month, the aid to families, the sort of money went out to for children, the child care tax credit that's payable just started going out. So you're seeing, a lot of this sort of is, and that's why you'll see in his presentation, FY22 and FY21. FY21 was major up, but FY22 which is the year that began in July, is also going to see this major up. And then we also get a sense that the infrastructure bill in Washington has sort of made in the last week some forward motion. Obviously it's not a done deal yet. This whole forecast assumes that there is something that passes, and assumes that there's also going to be a reconciliation bill in the fall that passes. So some of it's built in, the amount of it built in. I don't have the exact number, but it's not what's on the table now. We all try to estimate, what's going to end up coming out of Washington, but it's very much a moving target. It's very much a uniquely good situation. And as we talked about last week, Vermont in the country is probably one of the most the top 3 as far as what we receive. And I think that'll be in a chart down the road. Let's see what we've got here. Find any other ones that are really exciting. Pandemic related federal transfer payments. It's a chart that looks like this. That's about 3 more in. And that shows you District of Columbia, New York, and Vermont. There's the amount of per capita payments. And this is a really interesting chart for me because, and I asked Tom, and we don't know why New York got up so high. District of Columbia is very small and a lot of federal money coming in. You can see Vermont, Alaska, really small states, Rhode Island, North Carolina, Dakota, and they benefit from the small state set asides. But I couldn't tell you why New York is up there. And let's see if there's any others. I just want to point to in this chart, and then we're gonna. The cartoons, I'll let you read at your own pace. Skip some of these unemployments. You can ask about it. But one of the things that, you know, if we get to the unemployment pandemic reshuffles, the unemployment rate, this is less about what you're dealing with, but it's one of the things we can look at is where are the professions that are growing and shrinking, and you can see here leisure and hospitality. The unemployment is number of people employed is way less. Local government less, you know. And this may change. I think we just approved a lot of new positions on the state level. So I think if you were to look through this chart, a year from now, you'll probably see state government move up. And one of the things that in an earlier version of this, it was a winners losers chart. And if you were to talk about in January, one of the losers was the airline industry. They were in terrible shape. But now all of a sudden on this chart, they'd be off that losers list. So, you know, we're in a very volatile, changing world. And it just something when we look at the economy and look what it's going to do in Vermont, it's things change. Yeah.
On that graph on page 15.
Yeah.
It says pandemic reshuffles Vermont employment.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned leisure and hospitality. Is that the employment of Vermonters or Vermont jobs? Because like leisure and hospitality usually has a lot of international work.
Yeah, this is Vermont unemployment, Vermont employment. So it would be Vermont jobs, but
Vermont jobs, not necessarily.
yeah, and it may be that it may be places not being open. It may be that a lot of, as you probably seen the help wanted signs, there's just a lot less people working, and people are not less interested in working in those places. For whatever reason, that the employment numbers in those sectors have really dropped off. And also we're not fully open. You know, I think that all those reasons. But
And I know the ski industry suffered from not being able to have international employees, for example.
yeah. And I think you're right. It is sort of a national trend too. It's not like these numbers were done from Vermont, but I think a lot of these are nationwide types of factors. Next one, just flipping through these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. The inflation, you see where costs have gone up, used cars and trucks skyrocketing. And just the different inflation of different types of goods. And, the chart on, I want to say it's this one, page 40. And why do you recall get numbers? And I don't. Can I ask, where is the number on the bottom?
Yeah.
It's I must be my copying skills. So I probably didn't, but yeah, so on the one hand, we're seeing real housing values. This sort of reflects a higher housing value, but it's not as high as it's going to be. I think that looking at it, we sense that the housing is the ways to go. I think you'll see that the value increases you've been experiencing are going to continue for a while. And the next chart, which is the one that's sort of blue and gold here, really talks a little bit about something you mentioned last week. It's the sales to out-of-state buyers. And you start seeing this sort of fairly dramatic increase. And that's, as we talked about, that's a pressure on the market. It's a pressure on Vermonters that are trying to buy because you have this demand coming in. It's a real phenomenon. We don't know what the long-term implications are, but and you start seeing that there was a peak in this October period, and now January 2021, somewhat of a fall off, but hard to know where that's going to go. And then I guess the next chart is sort of a picture of where that's occurring.
Yeah,
Let me, I think that's pretty much it for the pretty pictures on this one. So then you get to one thing I wanted to do is switch over to this one-page document, which I sent out, which looks like this. And this is what we call the preliminary education fund outlook. This is sort of where we track the education fund, and the way it's organized is the top boxes tell you things about the population. For example, you can see the equalized pupil count, the 87,321, 86,944. And when we started doing this in the a long number of years ago, it was well over 100. So, you know, we continue to see the number of pupils dropping off in the school system. Then you see the statewide spending growth there, 3.9% in 21, dropping to 1.3 in FY22. I think you're going to see that even maybe lower, because what's happening is schools have a lot of federal dollars right now, and by spending the federal dollars, they don't need to spend as much of the state dollar as the other funds. So you may see, as that number drops, it puts less pressure on the education fund, helps to create a surplus in this fund. Then the what this next, when you look at the sources of funds, the education property tax, you know, there will be some growth. You see the income sensitivity sort of property tax credit 171 and 183 growing. And then and this is a projection in FY22. We'll see that real number, but the big growth has been in the sales tax, purchase and use tax, and meals and rooms was really low and it's starting to come back. Lottery did pretty well in 2021. And so these sort of non-property tax revenues have grown a lot. But what it means is we ended FY21, if you go to the very bottom where it says we've got a full reserve and we have 28.7 million on the bottom line of that fund. And then on line 32 here, then we have 66.7 on the bottom line in FY22. And that's after, you'll see on line 30, additional reserve for other post-deployment benefits. We reserved 14 million for you all and think about it. And this thing. And that's a lot of money. And so the question is, could that absorb the teachers OPEB? Probably, but there's other demands for that. One, I mean, as we talked about last week, you know, universal meals has been one that we'll talk about, transitioning to people waiting in a different way.
Could you do me a favor and just explain a little bit more for folks who maybe are following along from the outside and focused on the pension issue? Because when we were talking last meeting about the pressures on the general fund and the other things that are competing for these, you know, this gravy or the extra dollars that we weren't anticipating, help folks understand sort of what pupil waiting means and how that contributes to this conversation around the ed fund. Okay,
so so one of the concepts here is Vermont. Oh, this is really okay. Let me try. And you know, if I leave you people hopelessly confused, I apologize. It's so Vermont's education finance system still has local schools pretty much determining what is spent. And the way it works is we tell them at the state level, we provide a yield, basically what a dollar of tax rate will get in the way of money, and we sort of assume a certain yield. So if you spend more, you're going to end up, your town will pay more, your school district will pay more. So, but then what happens is we look at the schools, and not every school is funding, whether it's low-income kids, whether it's English as a second language, or people who have higher needs at the same level. And not every school has the same burden, need in those areas. So we don't have as a system a very big, right now we have a small weight for those types of kids, but there's a recent study which quite done through UVM, which was pointed out that this is an area where are we really serving all kids well? And if we were to really serve all kids well, maybe some schools should be providing more for people that require more to get educated, because maybe as English as a second language, you're going to have other barriers to the education. You need more services. low-income folk will be kids who will probably need more services, mental health. There's a number of things out there that are going to be that we need to think about. And I'm absolutely not. I'd love to bring in have a Mark Peralt talk about this more than I am, who's our staff for education. But so basically the question is, how do we make the system more responsive to student needs? And so to do that, one proposal is being talked about is to take how much every school gets in the way of for every dollar that they raise and increase the amount for schools who have more kids that are in those sort of in different need categories. So what happens is when if a school has somebody who, you know, whatever the sort of weighted category would include, they might get their pupil would be weighted at a higher level. So they would get for $1, they get more money than they would if they were a school that didn't have any kids in this area. So what happens is you're shifting, right? If you take a plain vanilla world, everybody gets the same amount for the dollar they spend. And it's not exactly like that. We do have some weighting built in. But if you dramatically increase the weights for school districts that have more kids, that have, you know, higher levels of needs, then you take the same amount of money and put it through this new system, what's going to happen is some schools are going to get more money, and some schools, their student body will be such that they'll get less money. You know, so if you just implement this on the existing with the existing dollars, you're going to have schools with tax rates go fairly dramatically up and tax rates are going to go down. Maybe, because the other question is, what spending choices do these towns make? If a town does what you were really designing the system to do, say, okay, we're getting more money, but we need to spend it because we really need to serve these kids better. We don't control that. So here you are saying, we're making it easier to spend money on kids that have these types of needs. We're giving you more money, but there's nothing that says it's going to get spent. But have I totally lost everybody yet? Are people following this? Okay. So you know, you have this thing where you make it easier for those communities to spend money. They can also use it to reduce taxes in those communities. But either way, you're changing who pays, and you're changing what different towns are going to get in the way of aid, or it's not aid, the way what their tax will bring in. So if you're trying to implement a system like this, there's lots of questions, but one of them is, how do you sort of smooth that transition, or what do you do for those communities that, for whatever reason, or because your system's not built like that, and all of a sudden you're valuing certain pupils and giving them maybe 3 times as much weight than you would an ordinary pupil? What, you know, how, if you're in one of those communities, you're not a very big community that currently got each student valued at essentially 1 student. If all of a sudden your students are other community, your pupils are valued higher, you're going to get more. If your pupils, if you have the same money, you're going to get potentially quite a bit less. And so what will happen is the tax burdens will shift dramatically between towns. And there's spreadsheets on this on our website. If you want to look at your town, you can sort of see it and be happy or sad, you know. And the dilemma is, whenever you do a major public policy switch, you really want to think about how do you implement it in a way that doesn't just create dislocations. And you know, there are other ways to do this. Do you do it through a weighting system, or the other thing you can do is do it through a categorical weight, where you say, we're giving you this money specifically for this type of function. And then you actually eliminate one problem, which is the choice of spending, because you are giving them the money to spend on this purpose. You don't get it if you don't spend it. But there's a whole committee that's debating weighting, but it does affect tax rates, it affects, you know, people, and it creates there's definitely going to be a demand for money. If that moves forward quickly, many millions of dollars could be used in smoothing that out over a period of years.
And I guess I asked you to explain a little bit more about it, because I think it's important for folks looking at the pension challenge to understand that there is a compelling and growing chorus of voices from within the legislature, but also from the communities who have recognized that over time, this Act 60, equal spending theory that we've had is really not meeting the needs of certain kinds of communities, because when you have densities of populations of kids who've grown up in poverty, or kids who need extra services for other reasons, that is a net drain on that school district, and provides an inequitable access to education. And so we have an opportunity here with some excess revenue, but I just want to make sure that folks on the task force understand that I don't think we're going to be first in line to make a compelling case to use this to help with the pension problem, because I think what it's going to come to, my read of the political, and it's not joint fiscal's place necessarily to comment on that, but my read of the political is that there is going to be a compelling call for equity in education access that is going to require more of this money to be used to not create complete reversal of the funding structure. I mean, you remember the Goldtown, outrage that, all of a sudden property wealthy towns were seeing their tax rate spike when Act 60 went into place. This is going to be on that magnitude. It's just going to hit differently, geographically, and it's going to be really hard conversation to have. And I suspect that there's going to be a strong desire to use any excess revenues to help move in that direction.
It's similar to, not quite at that level, but it was a huge discussion in the Senate this past year about universal meals. And that is, there's a lot of concern about kids' ability to access food. And we helped this last year because the federal government provided a lot of resources for food. But there are other states that have moved in this way farther than we have. The net proposals we're looking at were $40 million a year to the education fund. Depending on whether you provide just universal breakfast, you provide some type of copay, or whether you just provide, open-ended universal field meals. So that's another one. There's not quite at the same level, but I would say that it's got some legs. People are thinking about it. And then the other thing that goes on is tax rates. There's a lot of pressures to keep the property tax rate down, and especially as one of the things we talked about last week in Burlington was that residential property tax rates are rising, commercial tax rates are falling. And so that puts pressure on the system and means that the legislature may want to say, oh, we have money in the bottom line. We can lower for every penny we go down. It's a little bit over $10 million. We can cover that. So do we take this and lower tax rates? So just reiterating the point the representative made, it's just not there's other pressures, and it'll be in the education fund, it'll be true in the general fund. I mean, the general fund, we went over them last week. One of the things that we do this time of year, or that happens this time of year, is the administration sits in their land and says, what are we going to tell the departments for budget instructions? Traditionally, what happens is they say, well, things are really tight. We'd like you to come in with a budget proposal that is level funded. Give us fund what you funded the prior year, and basically eat any increase in costs, whether it's pay act, piece like that. So one of the things we're going to be looking for in September probably is the budget instructions. What's happened is agencies have been under a lot of pressure. I would be totally surprised if they don't come in with come in with a budget that's up 3%, 4%, because we're in a different world now. So that will take money off the table. Is sort of the whole question about, do we reach out and say to agencies where you've sort of been constantly limiting where their resources, that we need to recognize that they've been pretty hard pressed, and it's sort of the general governmental functions. And it affects jobs all over the state, it affects people, affects services. So by giving them a little bit more room, it is going to take money off the table. Let alone the ones that are just over the next few months, one of the ones that was a big pressure, and I'm still thinking to the speeches, is global warming. We've all seen that, how it affects our, every day here, affects the rest of the country. There's a group out now that's coming up with a proposal to, and we talked about this again last week, to spend a lot more on transportation and buildings. Their initial proposals are for more spending. The detail is not there yet. But these are all the types of things you'll be competing against or being evaluated against. And we get to that, you know, when we were in the emergency board last week and the governor and the 4 chairs of the money committees, we had an amazing event, which was, for me anyway, which was after the presentation, the governor and the 4 money chairs, usually they'd go their own ways and there's all these pressure, but they all sat around and chatted for a while. And it was a very sort of unusually long interchange. And I think what it is as Tom and Jeff, the forecasters indicated, this is really a incredibly unique period. And when they talk about transformational, this is on everybody's minds. You know, what can we do with this money that's going to really transform Vermont in the way we want it to transform? So what does that mean? You know, we don't know, but it is all these things. It's broadband, it's global warming, it's the pension issue, which you guys are all dealing with. I mean, if you think about where we set up tremendous new entities to deal with broadband, to deal with global warming, a committee, to deal with pensions, I think they're going to be looking at spending in that sort of through those types of glasses. Is what's coming out something that's going to really address a problem? Think about it transformationally differently, or is it just you know? And I'm trying to not use sort of value-laden terms, but just sort of throw some money at it and say, hopefully it'll go away. It's going to really, they're going to look at the thoughtfulness of the solution. And I know that we're talking on the legislative side about, you know, do we bring people in to talk to us about this? You know, do we really, how do we look at the idea of government's role? And years ago, we were in the opposite situation. We were making tremendous cuts, and at the then Speaker of the House addressed the legislature and said, you know, sometimes when you're making cuts, you know, you're actually transforming government. You're trying to figure out what the important things to do are. And we're in the reverse of that situation now. But it's so it becomes one of the things to think about. It's just you're part of it. You're taking one of the biggest problems we face as a state, and just your ability to access resources is going to be affected by the I would say by the credibility of your solution. You know, how it reflects things.
Does it pass the transformative?
Yeah, whatever that is. You know, it's sort of like, is it something that's really taking a problem? Is it credible? Is it complete? Does it give you sort of is it addressing risks? Is it thoughtful? And you know, we have like external evaluators, like we have the bond agencies who look at these things, and they have to think about it. And so it's not I mean, you can choose what you do. You can choose just to sort of come at it with ideas and be done. And I think that that's going to be an issue the global warming people are trying to figure out. You know, how prescriptive do you get? How much do you really think about coming up with a plan? You know, that is thorough, transformative, and thoughtful. And as you know, everybody here, you all come from different parts of this world, and you're all going to have different values, goals, whatever. And just can you put something together that reflects them all? And it's a challenge. You guys are probably one of the hardest challenges around. It's not. It's great we have all these resources, but people are going to be looking at it from a thing of how are they used, how are they thoughtful, how is this really going to make a difference? You know, the 5-10 years out. So that's the end of my spiel. But I can go ahead and answer. I can go beyond my world.
Can I ask you a question about that? I'm curious. Like we're working right now in isolation.
Yeah.
And you're sort of portraying this image, in my mind anyway, of, you know, you get to January and, you know, everyone starts wanting to sort of grab at the money, and the different task force outcomes are presented, hoping to grab some of that money. Is there a way to just own the intersectionality of it all in the next months and come up with more integrated plans?
Well, see, but what happens is the integration happens with the governor and his staff when they think about what different pressures are, and it happens in the legislature. You have appropriations committees, you have a whole legislative body that's going to take all the different interest groups, which you're basically one of them, and put them together and try to come up with something that makes sense, as is the administration. And it's not, your job is, you're one part of that large thing. You're creating as much as you can, a piece here, and there's the public, public, you testify, individuals will testify, everything you do will go out to them. But there is a process, it's sort of the governmental process we live in, with different branches of government. Each one of them will have their own view of what the right thing to do is. And then the public weighs in and you end up with a budget and a plan. So you are fodder to that project, to that process. And I would think.
And correct me if I oversimplify or misstate, but in general, the process of coming together around a consensus forecast of revenue is so that between now and when the legislature gets back into session, the governor can write a budget and make a decision about how to spend that money. So the starting point for the legislature is not a blank slate. It is in fact what the governor proposes, and the governor could very well propose different ways of using the excess revenue, and that becomes the starting point for the conversation in the Appropriations Committee in the House.
Yeah, and there'll be one more revenue forecast in January, which will basically, but the governor is going to, this is the one they start working with. And what happens is every month we give them an update of and the legislature of where we are versus to give you that forecast. Graham tracks it for us, and but he'll know, he'll build probably an initial budget, and he'll build if we get an extra 20 or 30 million, this will do with it. But he's the first one out. He comes out with this proposal. The legislature then modifies it, but and that it is part of it's the political process we're in. And it really is, I shouldn't say it, but it's true. I personally feel it works. It's a pretty thoughtful legislator, a pretty thoughtful governor right now. It's not, in some states it may be more political. It really is people trying to figure out what makes sense for Vermont. Anyway.
I have a couple questions. One is a little bit broader, and then a couple that are in the weeds. Going back to the tables on page 36.
Which is, you better hold it up and tell it for people like me that are.
Well, even the title.
The end of the document that you took us to right after you showed us the first page.
Okay.
I just want to sort of make sure I'm understanding the big picture here of revenues. We see a pretty significant uptick in FY 2021 at 7.8%, FY 22 at 4.9%. And then going forward, the growth mark, but it's off that base. It's not that the stimulus effects are necessarily fleeting. They are persistent, but they just don't, the trajectory.
Right. And so what's interesting about that, and I would have thought it would have been different. I would have thought you would have seen this upward thing and then a deterioration. And this is sort of I think this assumes that a lot of what we see in the way of upward money is going to lead toward people are going to use it wisely. People are going to transform how we do business, and a lot of it will lead to permanent structural change. But it's again, all the subsequent years are very, very, very tentative.
It's a best guess.
Yeah.
My first in the weeds questions, I think last week you mentioned that we would have full reserves. So I'm just wondering how much money we were putting towards reserves and kind of the fortunate, the good financial planning that was put into place. How much money does that free up?
So our reserves on the general fund side, which is probably it's more the primary one that we think about. The reserves are right now about 16% in three buckets. We have a 5% stabilization reserve, which we generally don't touch. It's basically to deal with the volatility of revenues. Then we have 5% what we call a rainy day fund. This first time in ever it's been fully funded. And what that does is it's again to deal with it can be spent. And the idea is if the revenues drop 2%, you spend it, or if there are other needs, you can spend it. Again, it's to deal with, unlike the first one, where you really try to leave that 5%. This one is designed to be spent. And then we have caseload reserve, which is basically money we've set aside for changes in, like if the economy goes, caseload starts soaring, or and you don't have the federal relief we had. If we had had this pandemic without the same level of federal assistance, you would have needed tremendous investments in healthcare, things like that. And so that's probably another 6%. Other states around the country are talking about reserves of 25%. I mean, some are way less than we are. It's unfortunately, there's no right answer here. It's all a case of risk. Trying to, what's the right level to prevent risk? I mean, I think we're pretty good at 16. I mean, it's more we ever had, and it's, but I couldn't even begin to tell you what the right thing to do is.
I guess maybe I could try to phrase it another way.
Okay.
How much did we put into reserves in FY21 and how much is projected total reserves?
Okay. So we normally, most of it's just keeping it at 5%. The big difference this year is we put about 44 million into the rainy day fund, and that brought it up to 5%. That's probably the biggest change. So we put that. This was one of the things the law required was, I might have been 48. I might have been 48. What we did is any surplus, the first 100 million was spent to replace the federal funds, and we talked about this last week. The next 52 million went to the city employee OPEB, and the rest went to the rainy day fund until it was filled at 5%. So the number is about 48 million.
But that was on the plan. That's not answering your question. Your question is, what do we plan on putting in
every year? We just try to keep right now.
Try not to spend it.
Only the stabilization reserve is required to be kept at 5%. So there's nothing inherently saying the rainy day fund will be kept at 5%, but we have to have surplus to put in there. But once you hit that 5%, the amounts to keep it there are not huge.
I'll just add that the Government Finance Officers Association, the GFOA, they recommend that state and local governments of any size have a reserve of no less than 2 months of their revenues on hand. So that 2 out of 12, 2 divided by 12 works out to be around 16%.
Okay, you spoke to the revenue upgrades for the next couple fiscal years, and we understand that last week Tom was asked if these increased revenue forecasts should be treated as new base revenue or not. Can you speak to that, and if that should be viewed as new base on the general fund or more like one-time funds?
Yeah, so that's pretty much what I was saying earlier, that he was asked directly that question. The question was, how much, if we go up 200 million, do we spend that 200 million as base? And his comment was, he didn't recommend doing that. He said, take a number at his, and I don't have the tape, remember exactly, but what he said, spend 60% as new base, I think was his, and then 40% spend in a way that you can invest in changing in one-time expenditures that make a stronger system. But that's the unclarity, just what should be that number be? And there is no real, legislature will have to decide what they do. I think, conservative number might be spend 60% of it in base, and then like he suggested, I think 60 to 80 is where we'll be, but I don't have any, actually I'll have very little impact since I won't be here, but I think that'll be one of the questions. And so I think that's, and a lot of these expenses we look at could be one time or could be ongoing, depending on which one you're talking about.
One more question. Can you provide some color on how the impacts of the still the common infrastructure spending and reconciliation bill were kind of incorporated? I mean, I imagine that it's just a huge challenge to incorporate because the bills aren't even written. And certainly want to err on the conservative side as you so just kind of wondering how you approach that and try to incorporate those.
So I think the way it works, this is like, I always think revenue forecasters make companies one number, and you marvel at these numbers where they're out to 52,400,000. And then when you really look under the hood, you realize there is a lot of art in this as far as science. So what we do is, and what Tom did in this situation is he made a rough estimate of how much is going to come out of Congress. And luckily up to now, it's not too far off, whether it's 1 trillion over time or 800 million, somewhere in that general vicinity. Then we look at what's historically come to Vermont, which is usually a larger share than what we normally would be entitled to, because we have a fairly impressive delegation. And then we look at that, and that goes into a sort of a macro forecast of the economy. And so in that sense, we take into account. What we don't take into account, and what we can't do now is, as you said, we sort of begin to know that they're talking about money for global warming. They're talking about money for water-related issues and housing and what the specific money, transportation. We don't know where the specific funds will be and how that'll help us with the pressure. So that'll be something at the end of September, October, we'll start being able to add that to the equation, and it may mean that pressures we have today will be less than in certain areas than others. So the way it's being incorporated now is they make a guess at how much Vermont will get out of these packages. If it turns out the packages totally die and there's no more money, these forecasts become fairly aggressive. If it turns out that we get way more money, these forecasts go up. So one of the things we've talked about is with Tom and generally is, do you do a forecast? Do you do like a variety of forecasts? If this happens, if that happens, but the temptation for the way we work is sort of, we just say, here's our forecast, here's the risks. And it allows us a starting point for thinking. And it really is just, it's actually changed more in the last few years than it ever has before because of the world we're in. But there have been years where we can do a much better job of projecting things. This is probably the period of time where projections are most challenging.
That was really helpful to understand how you.
Any other questions with respect to the revenue forecast?
Cool.
Right.
Well, thank you. And you have quite a challenge. It's we all do. It's a really interesting situation.
Thank you. So folks, we have a 15-minute break scheduled so people can stretch their legs and top off their water glasses and wish that there was a place you could get a cup of coffee. So we will be back here at 2:30 to commence with Chris Root.